Thomas Garrett's boots crunched through fresh snow as he crossed the yard toward the barn. Christmas morning, 1885, and the world lay silent under Montana's pre-dawn sky. 42 years old. 15 of them spent alone, and he preferred it that way. The lantern swung in his gloved hand, casting shadows across drifts piled high against the fence rails. He'd feed the livestock, mend the loose board on the mare's stall, maybe ride out to check the north pasture fence before the day warmed. Christmas was just another day when you had no one to share it with. Inside the barn, his breath fogged the cold air. The mare whickered nervously, stamping in her stall. Thomas frowned. She wasn't one to spook easy. Then he heard it. A cry, thin and desperate, cutting through the silence like a knife. His heart stopped. He raised the lantern higher, scanning the shadows. There in the manger, where he'd laid fresh hay the night before, a bundle wrapped in a faded quilt, and that cry again, stronger now, insistent. Thomas moved forward slowly, like approaching a spooked colt. He pulled back the quilt's edge with trembling fingers. A baby, hours old, maybe less. Her face was red from crying in the cold, tiny fists waving, eyes squeezed shut against the lantern's sudden light. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. A scrap of paper lay tucked beside her, the handwriting shaky and desperate. "Please love her. I cannot. God forgive me. A mother with no choice." Thomas stood frozen, the lantern trembling in his hand. His first thought was to ride to town, find Sheriff Wade. Let someone else handle this. But town was 8 miles through snowdrifts, and this child wouldn't survive an hour in the cold, much less the journey. The baby's cry intensified, her whole body shaking with it. Something in that sound pierced through 15 years of careful numbness. Before he could think, he was lifting her, awkward and terrified. This tiny life fitting in his calloused hands like she was made of glass and light. She quieted almost immediately against his chest, seeking his warmth. Thomas stood there in the cold barn, holding an abandoned baby on Christmas morning, and felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. He didn't want this, didn't ask for it, but she was here, and she was real, and she needed him right now. "All right," he murmured. "All right then." He wrapped her carefully, tucking the quilt tight against the cold. His mare watched with liquid eyes as he carried the bundle toward the door. The note fluttered in his other hand, those desperate words already burned into his memory. Thomas paused at the barn door, looking out at his cabin across the snowy yard. Just until the storm clears, he told himself. Just until he could get to town and sort this out properly. Someone else would know what to do. Someone better suited. The lie felt thin even as he thought it. But he carried her forward anyway, into the growing light of Christmas morning. Toward a future he couldn't yet see. The cabin was stark and functional, built for a man alone. Thomas laid the baby on his table, the quilt beneath her, and stared down at what he'd gotten himself into. She'd quieted in the warmth, but those dark eyes watched him with an intensity that made his chest tight. "I don't know the first thing about babies," he said aloud. She blinked at him, solemn. He had cow's milk in the root cellar. That would work. Wouldn't it babies drank milk? He warmed it carefully on the stove, testing it against his wrist the way he'd seen women do once, years ago. Too hot. He waited. Tested again. Better. Getting her to drink was harder than he'd expected. She fought the spoon, milk dribbling down her chin, both of them frustrated. Finally, he dipped the corner of a clean cloth in the milk and let her suck on it. That worked. Slow, awkward, but it worked. "There you go," he murmured. "That's it." The diaper situation was a disaster. He'd never felt more incompetent in his life, and he'd once tried to shoe a half-wild Mustang in a thunderstorm. But he managed it eventually, using strips torn from an old shirt, pinning them with trembling fingers while she kicked and fussed. For a cradle. He emptied a drawer from his bureau and lined it with his softest flannel shirt. It would do until he could figure out something better. Everything was temporary. Everything. The day stretched long. Every cry sent him into problem-solving mode, hungry again. Wet again. Too cold. Too warm. Or just needing to be held. By afternoon. He'd learned her different sounds. The sharp cry meant hunger. The fussy whimper meant discomfort. The wail meant she just needed his arms around her. That night was the longest of his life. She wouldn't sleep unless he held her, so he walked circles in the cabin, humming tuneless songs he half remembered from childhood. His arms ached. His eyes burned with exhaustion. But every time he tried to lay her down, she'd cry. And he'd pick her back up. Around 2 a.m, she finally settled against his chest, her breathing evening out into sleep. Thomas sank into his chair, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had finally calmed her. His shirt was soaked with milk and tears, his and hers both. His hand, scarred from years of rope and leather, spanned her entire back. She was so small, so impossibly fragile. And she was breathing. Warm. Alive. He'd kept her alive for 1 whole day. Thomas watched the fire burn low, listened to her tiny breaths, and felt something shift inside him. Not commitment. Not yet. But present tense care. This moment. This need he could meet. Dawn crept through the frosted windows. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Thomas looked down at her face, peaceful now in sleep, and whispered words he didn't plan. "Reckon we made it through 1 night. Let's see about another." The 3rd night. Thomas sat in his chair holding the sleeping baby while moonlight streamed through frost-painted windows. His gaze drifted to Margaret's rocking chair in the corner. Empty for 15 years. "Don't know what you'd say about this, Maggie." He spoke to the darkness. "But she's here. And maybe that means something." The memories came unbidden. Margaret laughing in this very cabin, her hands flour-dusted from baking, sunlight catching the red in her hair. Her joy when she'd told him about the baby. His hands on her swelling belly, feeling their son move. Then the midwife's white face. Margaret's screams turning to terrible silence. The stillborn boy he'd held for 10 minutes. Memorizing a face he'd never see grow. 2 graves on the hill behind the house, and Thomas left behind in a world that had lost all its color. He'd stayed because the land was paid for, and leaving felt like abandoning them. The community had tried to help. Casseroles appeared on his porch, invitations to Sunday dinner, Widow Morrison making her interest clear. He'd refused everything, built walls instead. Safer to be alone than to risk that kind of destruction again. For 15 years. He'd succeeded. Worked his land, kept to himself, spoke to no one unless necessary. It was a half-life, but it was safe. The baby shifted against his chest, making small sleeping sounds. Her warmth seeped through his shirt, into skin that had been cold for so long. By all logic, he should ride to town come morning. Find Sheriff Wade, explain the situation, let them contact the orphanage in Helena. That was the sensible thing. The right thing. But Thomas looked down at her face, peaceful in sleep, and couldn't imagine handing her to strangers. Couldn't imagine this cabin empty again, silent again, after 3 days of her presence had filled it with sound and purpose. He was terrified. Of failing her, of losing her, of loving something this fragile and precious. His hands, which could rope a steer and break a wild horse, trembled around this tiny life. "You're here, and I'm here," he whispered, "and maybe that's enough for now." The decision settled over him like snow, quiet, inevitable, covering everything. He wouldn't take her to town. Not yet. Maybe not at all. The thought terrified him. But there it was. Dawn came soft through the windows. Thomas watched the light spread across the floorboards, across the baby's sleeping face, and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Hope. Dangerous. Fragile hope. He needed a name for her, something that meant what she represented. What had arrived on Christmas morning when he'd expected nothing but another lonely day? Grace, he said aloud, testing the sound. For what came when I didn't know I needed it. The baby Grace stirred at the sound of his voice but didn't wake. Thomas held her closer, understanding that he'd just crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. She was his now, at least in his heart. The rest of the world would have to catch up. Outside, the sun climbed higher, beginning to melt yesterday's snow. Inside, a lonely man held an abandoned child and chose, against all his fears, to try. January brought cold that bit deep. Thomas learned fatherhood through trial and error, heating bottles to the right temperature, walking circles at 3 a.m, singing rough lullabies about cattle trails and lonesome prairies. Grace grew stronger, her cries more insistent, her needs more complex, but his isolation became a problem. He was running low on supplies, and questions were piling up that he couldn't answer alone. When should she sleep through the night? Was this rash normal? How much should she eat? He needed help, which meant town. Thomas wrapped Grace in layers against the brutal cold and hitched the wagon. The 8-mile journey felt longer than usual, his stomach tight with dread. He'd kept her secret for 3 weeks. Now the world would know. The general store's warmth hit him like a wall when he pushed through the door. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. Thomas stood there, Grace bundled against his chest, and felt their eyes like brands. Martha Brennan recovered first. She was a widow, kind-faced, raising 3 grandchildren after her daughter's death. She approached slowly, gently, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. Thomas Garrett, she said softly. Is that a baby? Yes, ma'am. Where did she come from? He kept his answer simple, voice steady. Found her Christmas morning in my barn. Couldn't leave her. The whispers started immediately. Sheriff Wade pushed through the small crowd, his face unreadable. He was fair but thorough, not a man to let questions lie. That's a serious matter. Thomas, abandoned baby means an investigation. We'll need to know details. Don't have many to give. Someone left her in my manger with a note asking me to love her. That's all I know. And you've kept her 3 weeks without telling anyone. Thomas met his gaze steadily. Kept her alive. Kept her warm and fed. Did what needed doing. Doc Henderson appeared, his weathered face curious. Let me see her. Thomas reluctantly unwrapped enough for the old doctor to examine her. Henderson's hands were gentle but thorough. After a moment, he stepped back, nodding. She's healthy, well cared for. Actually, you've done good work. Thomas. The words eased something in his chest, but the whispers continued, speculation spinning through the gathered townspeople like wind through prairie grass. Martha touched his arm. You bring that baby by my place tomorrow. I'll show you proper how to bathe her, what signs to watch for. A man alone shouldn't be doing this without help. I'd appreciate that. Ma'am. But he heard the other voices too, not quite whispered. Man can't raise a girl proper. Should go to the orphanage. Ain't natural. Him alone with a baby. Thomas gathered his supplies quickly, paid, and left. The ride home felt colder somehow, despite Grace sleeping peacefully against him. He'd known there would be judgment, but feeling it was different than anticipating it. Back at the cabin, he settled Grace in her cradle and stood at the window, watching twilight paint the snow purple. The town's eyes would be on him now. Every decision scrutinized, every choice questioned. He looked down at Grace, sleeping so trustingly in the drawer that served as her bed. The whispers echoed in his memory. Man alone can't raise a girl proper. Thomas reached down, brushed her soft cheek with one rough finger. They might be right, he murmured. But you're here, and I'm here. And I'll be damned if I let their doubts matter more than that. He pulled his chair close to her cradle and settled in for another night of watching over her. The town could whisper. He had more important work to do. February brought Martha Brennan to his door every Sunday after church. She'd arrive with a basket of supplies and an endless well of patient instruction. Thomas learned to bathe Grace properly, to recognize the different types of crying, to mix oatmeal thin enough for her to manage. "You're doing better than most new fathers," Martha said one afternoon, watching him change a diaper with only moderate fumbling. "Most men won't even try. Don't have much choice." "You had a choice. Thomas, you could have handed her off first day. But you didn't." She folded clean cloths with practiced efficiency. "Town's still talking. Though," he stiffened. "Let them talk. They're saying you should give her up. That a man alone can't raise a girl proper. That she needs a mother." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "What do you say to that?" Thomas looked down at Grace, now 3 months old, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. She'd smiled for the first time last week, a real smile, not just gas, and the memory of it still made his chest warm. "She's mine," he said quietly. The word hung in the air, solid and true. "Town can say what it wants. She's mine." Martha smiled, something knowing in her expression. That's a father's answer right there. The days settled into rhythm. Grace grew stronger, more alert. Thomas found himself talking to her, constantly narrating his chores, sharing thoughts he'd kept locked inside for years. She couldn't understand, but she listened with solemn attention, sometimes cooing in response. One morning, changing her diaper, she looked up at him and smiled. Not the vague infant smile from before, but a real smile of recognition and joy. Thomas froze, something breaking open in his chest. He laughed. The sound felt foreign, rusty from disuse, but it came up from somewhere deep and real. He laughed, and Grace's smile grew wider, and Martha, visiting, witnessed the whole thing. "That's love," she said softly. "That look on your face right now. That's what they can't argue with." But shadows gathered too. A drifter came through town asking questions about an abandoned baby girl. Sheriff Wade mentioned it casually, but Thomas heard the warning underneath. Someone was looking. Grace's birth mother. Or her family, perhaps. People who might have legal claims Thomas couldn't fight. Late February brought a conversation with Martha that cut deeper. She sat across from him, Grace dozing in her arms, and spoke carefully. "Thomas, I need to tell you something hard. There's talk of bringing your situation before the town council. Some folks think Grace should go to the orphanage in Helena where she could be adopted by a proper family." His hands clenched. A proper family. One with a mother and a father both. Martha's eyes were kind but honest. "I don't agree with them. But you need to know what's coming. When March meeting, they'll discuss it officially then." That night, after Martha left, Thomas held Grace and told her stories about her first Christmas. About finding her in the manger, about their fumbling first days together, about the moment she'd first smiled at him. He was building their shared history, claim by claim, memory by memory, but uncertainty gnawed at him. What if they were right? What if she did need things he couldn't give: a mother's gentle hands, a woman's wisdom? Softness he'd lost when Margaret died. Grace fell asleep against his shoulder, her breath warm on his neck. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered to whatever God might be listening. "Sometimes God gives us a second chance wearing a different face," Martha had said earlier. "Question is, are you brave enough to take it?" Brave enough? He'd have to be. The town hall smelled of old wood and lamp oil. March mud clung to boots. Winter's last grip before spring. Thomas stood in the back, Grace bundled in his arms, and listened to his life being debated. Reverend Hutchins spoke first, his voice measured and concerned. "We gather tonight to address Thomas Garrett's situation. 3 months ago, he discovered an abandoned infant. While we commend his initial care, we must now consider what's best for the child's future. Thomas's jaw tightened. They were talking about Grace like she was a problem to be solved. A child needs a mother, Hutchins continued. This is not judgment of Mr. Garrett's character, but simple truth. A girl requires gentle guidance, a woman's touch, proper feminine instruction. A man alone, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot provide these essential elements. A murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Helena has a reputable orphanage, the Reverend went on. The child could be placed there and adopted by a suitable family, a mother and father who could give her the upbringing she deserves. Thomas felt Grace shift against him, her small hand curling into his shirt. She was 4 months old now, bright-eyed and curious about the lamplight, unaware that her future hung in the balance. Martha stood, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Has anyone here visited Thomas's home, seen how he cares for her? Silence. I have. Martha continued. Every Sunday for 2 months. That baby is healthy, happy, and loved. Thomas feeds her, bathes her, walks the floor with her at night when she can't sleep. He's learning everything a parent needs to know, and he's doing it well. But can he teach her to be a lady? Someone called out. Can he braid her hair and teach her to cook and prepare her for marriage? More murmurs. Some uncomfortable, some agreeing. Sheriff Wade spoke up, his tone neutral. Thomas, you want to say something? Every eye turned to him. Thomas felt the weight of their judgment, their doubt, their good intentions that threatened to tear Grace away. He needed words, eloquent arguments, but his throat felt thick with fear. I'm doing my best, he managed. She's healthy, happy. I can provide for her. But can you provide a mother's love? A woman called out. The question hung there, unanswerable. Thomas looked down at Grace, who gazed back at him with complete trust, and had no reply that would satisfy them. Reverend Hutchins's voice softened. No one doubts your good heart, Thomas, but we must think of the child's welfare. We propose a vote to recommend placement in Helena's orphanage where she can be adopted by a complete family. And if I refuse? Thomas's voice came out rougher than intended. Then we'll revisit this matter with the territorial judge. Sheriff Wade's tone held regret, but also resolve. The law has opinions about these things. The blizzard hit on April 3rd, unseasonable and vicious. Thomas had seen the signs, the stillness in the air. The way the horses acted nervous, but it came faster than expected. Within hours, the world disappeared into white chaos. They were trapped. He'd laid in supplies, but not enough for a siege. By the second day, the milk was running low. By the third, Grace developed a fever. Thomas had never known fear like this. Her skin burned hot, her breathing came shallow and quick, and all he could think about was Margaret. This was how it started: fever, weakness, then the terrible slide toward death. No, he said aloud, pacing with Grace against his chest. Not again, please God, not again. But the fever climbed. Grace whimpered, too sick even to cry properly. Doc Henderson was 8 miles away, through a blizzard that had already killed 2 men last winter. Going for help meant possibly dying in the attempt. Staying meant possibly watching her die in his arms. Thomas made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He wrapped Grace in every blanket he had, placed her in a box packed with heated stones, and prayed she'd stay warm enough. Then he saddled his horse and rode into hell. The wind hit like fists. Snow blinded him within minutes. Thomas navigated by instinct and desperation, trusting his horse when he couldn't see 3 feet ahead. Twice he nearly turned back. Once he thought he'd gone in circles and was hopelessly lost. But the image of Grace's flushed face drove him forward. He'd lost Margaret and their son. He would not lose her too. He didn't remember the last mile, only stumbling onto Doc Henderson's porch and pounding on the door with numb fists. Doc took one look at him and started packing his bag. The baby. Fever, high, can't get her to eat. Thomas's voice cracked. Can't lose her. Doc. The ride back was worse, if possible. Doc's horse followed Thomas's, both animals fighting the storm. They made it because they had to. Because Grace needed them. Because sometimes will is stronger than weather. At the cabin, Doc examined Grace with calm efficiency. Thomas stood frozen, terrified of what he'd hear. "It's a cold," Doc said finally. "Bad one, but just a cold. Keep her warm, get fluids in her however you can, and she'll be fine." The relief nearly dropped Thomas to his knees. Doc made her drink water mixed with a little honey, showed Thomas how to keep the fever down with cool cloths. Then he turned to Thomas with an expression that was half exasperation, half respect. "You nearly died riding for me, in a blizzard that's already killed grown men. She needed help. You love this child." Not a question. Thomas's voice came out raw. "More than I thought I could love anything again." Doc packed his instruments slowly, measuring his words. "Then you'd better fight for her, Thomas, because they're coming for her. The town, the law, good intentions. They'll take her unless you give them a reason not to." "What reason would satisfy them?" "The truth. Your truth, not what you think they want to hear." Doc put a hand on his shoulder. "Tell them what you just told me, that you'd ride through a killing storm for her, that she's saved you as much as you've saved her. Make them see what I see, a father who'd die before he'd fail his daughter." After Doc left, the storm began to break. Thomas sat by Grace's cradle, watching her sleep peacefully now, the fever already dropping. His hands still shook from the ride, from the fear, from how close he'd come to losing everything. But Doc's words settled in him like stones. Fight for her. Tell the truth. Stop asking permission and start claiming what was his. When the storm cleared 2 days later, Thomas stood in the April sunlight and made a decision. He'd petition the town council formally to adopt Grace. He'd stand before them and speak his truth, however inadequately. He'd fight. That afternoon, he planted a garden. Vegetables, yes, but also a small plot of wildflower seeds Martha had given him months ago. "For when you're older," he told Grace, who watched from a blanket spread on the porch. "You'll like flowers." It was an act of faith. Faith that they'd be here to see them bloom. Faith that he could be the father she needed. Faith that love, however imperfect, was enough. Late April dressed the town hall in spring's reluctant finery. Mud dried to dust, and early wildflowers dotted the roadside. Thomas arrived early. Grace in his arms, wearing a gown Martha had sewn white cotton with tiny embroidered roses. The hall filled slowly. Familiar faces, some sympathetic, others doubtful. Reverend Hutchins sat in front, his expression troubled but certain. Sheriff Wade leaned against the back wall, watching everything with careful eyes. Martha squeezed Thomas's hand as she passed. "Tell them your truth," she whispered. The meeting opened with formalities. Then Hutchins stood, clearing his throat. "We gather to hear Thomas Garrett's petition to formally adopt the child known as Grace. Before we hear from Mr. Garrett, I feel compelled to restate our concerns." He spoke gently, but his words cut. "A child needs both parents. A girl especially needs a mother's guidance. Mr. Garrett's devotion is admirable, but devotion alone cannot replace what nature intended a complete family. There are married couples in Helena who'd welcome her." Another councilman added, "Good people who could give her everything a mother's love, a father's provision, siblings, a normal life." Thomas felt Grace shift in his arms. She was 5 months old now, bright and curious. She grabbed at his collar, babbling softly, unaware this moment would decide her future. Sheriff Wade's voice cut through. "Thomas, you got something to say." Thomas stood slowly. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "You're right that I don't know everything, that I'm learning as I go, that I can't give her a mother." He paused, looking down at Grace's trusting face, then back at the council. but I can give her love. I can give her safety, a home. I can teach her to be strong, honest, kind. I can show her every single day that she's wanted, that she wasn't a mistake or a burden, but a gift. Someone shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. You asked me once if I could provide a mother's love. I can't, but I can provide a father's love. And that's not nothing. His voice grew stronger. I found her on Christmas morning in my barn, just like the first Christmas. New life in a humble place. I'd spent 15 years alone because I was afraid to love anything after losing my wife and son, afraid the pain would kill me. He held Grace a little closer. But this little girl didn't care about my fears. She needed me, and in needing me, she saved me. I'm not the same man I was 5 months ago. I'm better. She made me better. Martha stood suddenly. I support Thomas Garrett's petition. I've seen him with that baby every week since January. That's a father's love if I've ever seen it. Doc Henderson rose next. I watched him ride through a killing blizzard to get help when she took fever. Nearly died doing it. That's devotion. That's love. As far as I'm concerned. That's all a child really needs. One by one, others stood, not everyone, but enough. Mrs. Chen from the laundry. The Johnsons who'd lost their own daughter years back. Old Pete from the livery who'd once seen Thomas singing lullabies in the general store, completely unself-conscious. Sheriff Wade pushed off from the wall. I'll tell you what I've seen. I've seen a loner become a father. I've seen a man who wouldn't talk to anyone suddenly asking for advice, accepting help, joining the community. That baby did that, and he did that, by choosing her every single day. He nodded at Thomas. That's good enough for me. The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous. 3 voted against, but 7 voted in favor, including Reverend Hutchins, whose voice shook slightly as he said, Sometimes God works in mysterious ways. Who are we to argue with Christmas morning? Thomas barely heard the formalities that followed. Grace was legally officially, permanently his daughter. Outside, in the spring evening. Martha hugged them both. You did it. We did it, Thomas corrected, his voice thick. Couldn't have without you. Walking to his wagon, Grace babbling happily in his arms. Thomas felt something he'd thought lost forever belonging, not just to Grace, but to this community that had tested him, and, finally, accepted them both. Let's go home, daughter, he whispered. For the first time in 15 years, that word meant something beyond walls and a roof. It meant family, may transform the valley into something worth believing in. Thomas's garden showed green shoots reaching toward sunlight. The wildflowers Martha had given him sprouted in their dedicated plot, nothing yet but leaves. But they'd bloom soon enough. Grace was 6 months old now, sitting up with help, grabbing at everything within reach. Thomas had converted the small back room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft cream, building a proper crib from pine he'd milled himself. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and made with love. The cabin had transformed. Curtains hung in the windows Martha's doing. Children's things scattered across surfaces that had been bare for years. Laughter echoed where silence had reigned. The door stood open to spring breezes more often than closed. Sunday morning, Thomas dressed Grace in her church gown and hitched the wagon. He hadn't attended service in 15 years, but things were different now. He was different. The church steps felt steeper than he remembered. Thomas paused at the door, Grace in his arms, suddenly uncertain. Would they welcome him? Really welcome him. Not just tolerate his presence. He pushed through. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Then Mrs. Chen smiled and waved him toward an empty pew. The Johnsons nodded greeting. Martha appeared from nowhere to coo over Grace's outfit. Thomas settled in the back, Grace on his lap. She grabbed his finger, chewing on it contentedly. When she made a small noise during the opening hymn, the woman in front turned not with annoyance but with a grandmother's smile. After service, the church steps became a gathering place. People surrounded them, asking to hold Grace, offering advice about teething and sleep troubles, inviting him to Sunday dinner. 3 different families, 3 different invitations. Thomas accepted the Johnsons' offer. Their home smelled of roast chicken and fresh bread. Their grandchildren played on the floor while Grace watched, fascinated. Conversation flowed easily: crops and weather and the small concerns of community life. He belonged here, not as the lonely rancher on the edge of town, but as Thomas Garrett, Grace's father, part of something larger than himself. That evening, back home, Thomas sat in his chair with Grace drowsing against his shoulder. Golden light slanted through clean windows. Outside, the garden grew. Beyond that, the land stretched toward mountains still snow-capped in the distance. He pulled out his Bible, carefully extracting the note he'd kept pressed between pages. The desperate handwriting seemed less sharp now, more like a gift's wrapping than an abandonment. Please love her, I cannot. God forgive me. A mother with no choice. Thomas looked down at Grace, nearly asleep, her dark lashes resting on round cheeks. He'd kept that promise, that plea from a desperate woman. He'd loved this child with everything he had. I do, he whispered, more than I knew I could. Grace's hand curled around his finger, holding on even in sleep. Outside, the day faded into twilight. The lamp burned warm on the table. The door stood open to spring's gentle evening, letting in birdsong and the smell of growing things. Thomas rocked slowly, Grace secure in his arms, and understood something fundamental. That Christmas morning, when he'd found her in the manger, he'd thought he was saving her. But the truth ran deeper and more complicated. She'd saved him too, saved him from loneliness, from a half-life lived in fear's shadow, saved him from the belief that loss meant never loving again. She'd given him purpose, community, a reason to wake each morning with hope instead of habit. The garden he'd planted would bloom soon. Grace would grow, learn to walk, to talk, to run through these rooms that echoed with life now instead of silence. Martha would teach her to bake. Doc would show her how to set a splint. The community would help raise her, the way communities always had on the frontier. But she'd be his daughter, his to love, to guide, to watch become whoever she was meant to be. Thomas looked up at the darkening sky through the open door. Somewhere out there, a desperate mother had made an impossible choice. He hoped she knew, somehow, that her daughter was safe, loved, home. Thank you, he whispered to the evening air, for trusting me with her. Grace stirred, made a small sound of contentment, and settled deeper into sleep. Thomas held her close, rocking gently, watching stars appear one by one in the Montana sky. 15 years ago, he'd thought his life was over. Tonight, holding this child who'd arrived on Christmas morning wrapped in desperate hope, he understood it had simply been waiting to begin again. The lamp burned steady. The door stood open. And in a cabin that had known only loneliness, a father and daughter rested in the peace of belonging. He'd been found on Christmas morning, too,